This is a philosopher that you've probably never heard of, but who is really interesting. And so I thought I would tell you about him. His name was Ammonius Saccas. He lived in the 3rd century, so around 2 millennia ago, and he was also an African philosopher. Now, in the ancient world, there were some well-known schools of philosophy. For example, Stoicism started in Athens, and there were also, for example, the Peripatetics, right? There was a bunch of different schools, but Ammonius was part of a school called Middle Platonism, and one of his predecessors was a very famous person named Plutarch. You know, I have a whole video on Plutarch, so if you want to learn more about him, go and watch that after this video. But basically, these people were all centered around the idea of Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. That's where they got the name Platonism, right? They were people who were interested in Plato, and what's really interesting about this guy Ammonius Saccas is that we don't actually have anything written by him. We only have letters that are addressed to him, so everything we know about him comes from other people talking about him. In fact, the only reason we even know his name is because someone wrote it down in a letter. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know what his name was. But we do have quite a lot of information about him just from these letters, which is really neat. Now, Ammonius was born in the city of Osara, but this was a city that was located in what is today Tunisia, so this is in North Africa. And according to one letter, he visited Rome at least twice during the reign of Septimius Severus, and that would place this at around the early 2nd century AD. And then we also know that he visited Athens, so the center of philosophical life back in the ancient world, and he spent many years studying philosophy there. And he ended up settling in Athens and teaching there for the rest of his life. In one of these letters, he is described as living on the sacred way, which could mean that he may have been a priest of some sort, but not necessarily. In any case, he was clearly respected in Athens. And we know this because in one of the letters, one of the people writing to him says that when he arrived in Athens, he went to see the philosophers there, and they were all very excited to see him. But they were too poor to actually host him or to entertain him. And so, this person who's writing the letter says, "Please help us out here. Please take care of our great philosopher Ammonius." So obviously these people really respected him. They looked up to him. He was kind of like a celebrity philosopher. There was also another philosopher who was very famous at the time named Heraclitus. He was a Stoic philosopher, and he was very good friends with the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. You know, the guy who wrote Meditations. So Marcus Aurelius would go to Heraclitus and ask him questions about philosophy. And we know that Ammonius and Heraclitus knew each other as well. And at some point Marcus Aurelius asked Heraclitus, "Since you're such good friends with Ammonius, why don't you get him to come and tutor me in philosophy? Why don't you bring him here to the palace so that he can teach me?" So Heraclitus did something kind of funny. He said, "No, you're not worthy yet. You need to be prepared to receive the teachings of Ammonius." And then he told Marcus Aurelius that he needed to read certain books before he would be ready to meet with him. And then he finally told Marcus Aurelius, "Okay, come at dawn and I will bring him to you." So then Marcus Aurelius gets up at, before sunrise, and he goes out to meet Ammonius. And Ammonius and Marcus Aurelius end up talking until late at night about philosophy. So obviously, Marcus Aurelius was worthy, in his opinion, to receive his teachings. But one thing that is very interesting is that we know that Marcus Aurelius had a copy of the Timaeus by Plato. And that was probably one of the books that Heraclitus told him to read before he came to teach him. And we know that because in one of these letters, Marcus Aurelius sends a copy of the Timaeus to Ammonius because he wants Ammonius to comment on it. So Marcus Aurelius had a copy and he asked his friend to comment on it, but sadly none of those comments survive to this day. So now let's talk about what we actually know about Ammonius's philosophy. As I mentioned, he was a Platonist philosopher, and so he believed in the immortality of the soul. He believed that the soul transmigrates into different bodies. And he also agreed with Plato that the purpose of the philosopher was to purify himself and to achieve a kind of spiritual enlightenment by contemplating the truth. This was the goal of philosophy. It was not just about, thinking about abstract concepts and things like that, but it was actually something that could change your life. And when you think about it, it makes sense that Marcus Aurelius wanted to study under him, because Marcus Aurelius tried to be a philosopher king, right? He tried to be a philosopher and also the most powerful man in the world, and I think that it was precisely because he was trying to do both of these things at once, being a philosopher and also being an emperor, that he needed to find a way to justify being in power. Because if you re a philosopher and you believe that the purpose of philosophy is to remove yourself from the affairs of men, then being an emperor is kind of the opposite of that, right? So he needed some way to reconcile these two sides of his personality, his desire for power and glory, and also his interest in philosophy. So we know that Ammonius had a big influence on Marcus Aurelius, and he may have helped him develop his ideas about how a philosopher can be in power. And in fact, in one of these letters, someone was asking for advice from Ammonius about how to deal with grief and how to deal with death. And in his response, Ammonius talks about the soul and how it is immortal, and that it is always changing. And he says, even the gods themselves partake of immortality by means of a never-ending generation, which continues to be born of itself. So he believed that everything was interconnected and that the soul was immortal, and that it was constantly changing. I find this really fascinating because the Stoics had a very different view of the soul. The Stoics believed that the soul was created by the gods, and it was unique to each individual person, and it would just pass over to the afterlife. But this is very different from what Ammonius believed, that the soul was immortal, and that it was constantly changing, and that it was involved in this kind of cyclical process of birth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth. And this actually makes me wonder if maybe Marcus Aurelius's views were actually closer to Ammonius' than they were to the Stoics, because we know that Marcus Aurelius talked about the cyclical nature of life and death, and how everything was interconnected, and how nothing was created and nothing was destroyed, how everything just changes form. So maybe this is something that he learned from Ammonius, but then again, the Stoics also believed that the soul was immortal. So they didn't believe that the soul died along with the body. So maybe there was more common ground between Ammonius and the Stoics than we think. In any case, we don't have enough information to say exactly what his views were and how they compared to other schools of philosophy at the time. One last thing I want to mention is that it seems that he had an influence on Neoplatonism, which was a later school of thought that was based on Plato's ideas. So in summary, we have very little information about Ammonius Saccas, but what we do know is that he was an African philosopher who lived in the 2nd century. He was part of the school of Middle Platonism, and he was a friend of Marcus Aurelius, who considered him to be one of the greatest philosophers of his time. He believed in the immortality of the soul and the interconnectedness of all things, and he taught that the purpose of philosophy was to contemplate the truth and to purify oneself. So he was a very influential philosopher, even though we know very little about him. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also enjoy the one I have on Plutarch, so go check that out. Thanks for watching.